Welcome to the Shift Chateau, the first female forward house at Wimbledon, presented to you by The Shift. Now, how many of you here know what The Shift is? Okay, well, we have a few more to convert into our cult. The Shift is a media platform that celebrates and uplifts the voices of women who are shifting culture, shifting the narrative, shifting humanity forward for a more equitable world for us all, right? And how do they do this? Well, they're very intentional about the community that they build, in the sense that it is intergenerational and interdisciplinary, where women are coming together to share their wins and fight the barriers that they're facing together. So, to talk about how we all got here to Wimbledon and to take you on a bit of a journey of the shift. The shift started with its inaugural issue celebrating the feminist icon that is Gloria Steinem and her 91 years of advocacy. In that spirit, Shift identified 91 women to celebrate, and that was the first inaugural issue. No pressure. They were like, how do we get to the next step? The next step was the Shift Makers Gala that was held at Harvard Art Museums, where four incredible women were honored: Lola Tang, Olivia Munn, Dr. Sylvia Earle, Eileen Gu. Interdisciplinary, intergenerational, women coming together to have very honest conversations about what it took to get there and how they are shifting the culture to make sure other women can also occupy these spaces. Coming back to Wimbledon, the next issue was going to focus on sports, mindset, and health. And what better place to have this conversation than at Wimbledon, one of the most iconic sporting venues in the world? And I just want to reiterate, it's 2026, and this is the first time there's been a female forward house at Wimbledon. So clearly there's a lot more that needs to be done. But thank you to the Shift for leading this wave of change. Thank you to all of you people here for being here, for believing in its mission. And critically, thank you to all the supporters who believe in its mission and have actually made sure that we can all be here. So today, we're going to talk about health. How many of you here have got a mammogram done? Pap smear done? Any sort of cancer screening done? Know what your hormonal tests are, levels are? Looked at egg freezing as an option? Well, I went through 4 rounds of egg freezing because my gynecologist looked at me and said, here you are 35, there you are 50. It was brilliant. And it came to a point when I had 3 egg freezings in 1 year. I didn't stop bleeding for 25 days. I can get my period after that for 45 days. It was havoc. And every time I was speaking to my doctors, they kept trying to gaslight me into being like, oh, no, you're exaggerating. To the point where I had to learn this line, and I tell this line to every single person going through egg freezing, where I had to look at them and go, how do you know? It's like, because I'm an expert. I've been doing this for so many years. Most of them were men. And I went, yeah, but have you injected yourself with this treatment? When was the last time you took this treatment? You think you're an expert because you're administering it. I am going through it. All this to say, I had to learn how to advocate for myself. And if you are a patient going through any of these journeys, advocacy is the last thing you want to do, but we learn to do it because that's the world that we're in. 2 days ago, we honored 2 incredible athletes, Martina Navratilova and Yusra Madini. Incredible athletes who've shaped history. But what did they speak about? They spoke about deeply personal issues that not just affected their athletic career, but also how their athletic mindset helped them navigate through those deeply personal issues. Martina spoke about how prostate cancer is the most curable cancer because it affects men. And one of our panelists who we would hear from today, I was speaking to her earlier, and I asked her, how did you come up with let me get the words right? The first non-invasive 3D breast ultrasound system. How did you come up with this? It's QT imaging. She said she's a technologist, and 1 out of 8 women in America suffer from invasive cancer. 1 out of 8 women. And there was no sort of research or resource to get them the help that they need. She said, for me as a technologist, it meant, how do I find purpose in the work that I'm doing? And very humbly, she said, well, I think I'm helping a few women. I think the number is over 400 million women that you are helping. So we can get behind that. So here we are gathered today to talk about health from a very real sense, in a way that it affects our humanity in a way that affects sports, in a way that it affects our culture as a whole. So, with that, thank you so much for being here today. I want to give it over to our moderator, Kiara Wilkinson, who's the Deputy Multi Platform Editor at LUK, who's going to lead an incredible panel where we're going to meet amazing women shifting the narrative for health, for equality for us all. Over to you, Kiara.
Well, thank you for that intro, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we continue to celebrate Harvard's Sports Shipmaker Awards here in London in the very exciting backdrop of the Wimbledon Championships 2026. So, my name's Chiara. I'm a journalist and an editor at Elle magazine, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. What we'll do is we'll start with a conversation, and then I will open up the floor to questions. So just keep that in mind as we go if you've got anything you think you'd like to ask. We've got a thrilling 45 minutes ahead of us. And what we're going to be discussing today is the execution shift in women's health. At the heart of that shift is a fundamental question. How can we turn knowledge into meaningful action to truly improve the lives of women? What's it take to translate old ideas into real-world impact? Scaling science, expanding access, and building a future where women's health is driven by measurable outcomes rather than just good intentions. And as we've already heard, this is a topic that impacts everyone. Just the other day, 3-time Wimbledon champion Chris Evert announced that her ovarian cancer had returned for a 3rd time, and therefore she will not be attending the championships this year. Earlier this year, it was also reported that men were receiving around 60% more new health funding than women under government plans to tackle gender-specific medical issues in the UK. Now, these headlines remind us why moving from awareness into action has never been more important. We've got 4 incredible women who are with us today that are leading that shift, turning science into solutions, expanding access, and driving real change in women's health. And if you all don't mind just coming up and joining me, we'll get you a mic.
So you get 3 bikes, and then the 2 of you could just share a bike. That's just share a bike. Trade.
Here you are. So joining us today, we have got Ralika Dinu, who is the CEO of QT Imaging, the first non-invasive 3D breast ultrasound system. She could give us a little wave. We've also got Susan Wang, who's a biotech investor at T. Rowe Price. Yeah. Caroline Jeffries, Scientific Director, the Centre for Research in Women's Health and Sex Differences at Cedars-Sinai. And finally, you got Jaya Rosenmeyer, the Global Clinical Leader at Novartis, and she was previously AstraZeneca's Clinical Development Leader. All of these women have played their part in driving innovation and change in women's health, and it's a topic that's always on our radar here at Elle, not least because it's of utmost importance to our readers, but also because we each hold our own personal experiences and challenges in this space. So I think if we just get started, if we could just give a quick intro of who you are and what you do and why it's important. Do you want to start, Susan?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Susan. I'm currently an investor with T. Rowe Price. For me, medicine's been in my family for many, many generations. Actually goes back to like being named sure doctors and dynasties. So for me, it was really important to bring transformational science to patients and actually impact healthcare. One of the reasons why instead of getting a medical degree, I went to grad school and got a PhD because I wanted to answer questions that aren't answered yet. But there's that disconnect, right? Like the gap between actually bringing great science, great medicine to patients. And so when I became an investor, you might think, well, if it's good drug, the drug's always going to get funded. And the story isn't that simple because for a drug to get funded and then for it to actually get to patients, you actually need to execute. It takes multiple hurdles and crossing those barriers in order to get it to patients from research discovery to clinical development to commercialization and having the right infrastructure, payer reimbursement, etc. So for me as an investor, I think it's very important that I actually work with the management teams, work with the companies to help them execute and be an investor beyond just providing capital. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Luca Dino. I am the CEO of QT Imaging. QT Imaging is headquartered in Novato, about 35 to 40 minutes north from Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. We focus on using ultrasound, so non-invasive radiation of any sort, for us to generate 3D quantitative images of the breast. It's extremely important to get to quantitative images of the breast because at this point in time, we need further exploration of dense breasts. About 50% of women in the United States have dense breasts, and mammography still misses cancers in women with dense breasts. Thus, our purpose is to help those women to change to include in the healthcare system today options for women that have dense breasts. Pleasure meeting everybody today.
Hi, I'm Jaya Usmaya, and I'm a practicing cardiologist, first and foremost in that sense. And I'm a heart failure specialist, and I work patients with ischemic heart disease, patients with PET, my QC.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I request you to keep the mic really close to you? Yes, cover with all your important are say. Feel like you're kissing the mic. It's okay. You want to hear you.
Using the mic.
Then you'll be being a singer.
What I also do is that I run some innovative research at one of the 10th largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And there I am trying to push for having more female patients included in the trials. This is a major problem in healthcare today because cardiovascular disease is the #1 global killer of women. It is not necessarily cancer, as we've heard a lot about the other days. It's actually cardiovascular disease. And a lot of things need to change for women, especially to improve their prognosis in this arena. One of the reasons is I think that we've always looked at cardiovascular care with men. Men and women are not biologically alike when it comes to a lot of different cardiac diseases. One major gap, I think, for the future will be how can we include more women in trials, and that holds a lot with the pharmaceutical companies, as those are the ones that are executing these enormous 10, 20,000 patient trials. And if we don't get enough women in there, so the statistics become better, the outcome will always only read on the male sex. And I keep telling my colleagues that women are not small men. They are actually quite unique. And the female hormones are protecting us until the time when we reach menopause. But from the time we get through menopause, your risk of cardiovascular disease explodes. And so there's a huge translational gap there that needs to be looked at. And when I treat patients in my clinic, women come with symptoms that are quite different from men's. And they're often told that this is just because you're sweating because you have a menopausal problem, or you're dyspneic because you're too overweight. But really, those are subtle signs of having heart failure always, or you should at least have a checkup for it. And so I try to make it my mission to just stay on the ground and treat patients in my clinic, but at the same time also try to develop medicines and try to push within the industry to get more included in trials. It's very, very difficult, but hopefully we'll see a pattern change in the future.
Hi, I'm Caroline Jeffries. I'm a professor of medicine and an immunologist. I work at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I lead a group that is researching autoimmune disease and women's health. And this is particularly important because autoimmune disease disproportionately affects women. 70% of all autoimmune diseases affect women. And the disease that I work on, which is lupus, actually affects women 9 times more than it affects men. So 90% of lupus patients are women. And yet, when I first started in researching on lupus, that question and why women were more affected by autoimmune disease was not an issue. So, as our moderator said, Chiara said, I'm also the scientific director of the Centre for Research in Women's Health, or CRUWS, at Cedars-Sinai. And what really drives me in my research is trying to understand how the immune system behaves differently between men and women, and what that means and how that shapes diseases that disproportionately affect women, such as autoimmune disease, but then we also have neurological disease, neurodegeneration, and we obviously have the reproductive diseases, and I could go on and on. We really need to understand how men and women are different, as was just mentioned, but because if we don't understand how they're different, then we can't basically tailor treatments accordingly. So for me, it's all about the immune system, and I think that's my bias. I think the immune system is probably at the root cause of most diseases, and if we don't understand how men and women are different immunologically, then it's going to be very difficult to treat disease properly.
Thank you so much for that. And great to have such a wide scope from the research side, the financing, and already some really important points raised there. I think what I would like to hear, just to get started, and feel free to jump in when you have a thought, is what has your journey kind of taught you about creating change actually in the systems that weren't originally designed for women in mind? And was there a specific one in your career where you sort of were changed, where you thought what was possible for women in healthcare?
Okay,
Do you want to go?
So being in finance, it's very heavily male dominant space. And a lot of times, right, like when you start off in finance, especially from a woman's perspective, there are a lot of considerations in terms of you thinking like, oh, what can I say? Even if you have a thought, you might hesitate a little bit more, especially if you're in a room that is more male dominant. But I realized as I progressed in my career that as long as I have conviction in what I do and what I believe in, and I speak up and just say what's on your mind and have transparency and communication skills, I actually get really positive feedback and more change from my peers. And they actually ask for my opinions, my advice, right? So I think a lot of times maybe there is a little hesitation, a little self-doubt, but if you have confidence in yourself and you speak up, then it can be received with positivity. And I've already seen that change around my peers in terms of who I work with.
Yeah, and then it has that ripple effect as well. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Happy to. That's great answer right away. Absolutely.
Just remember to roll the mic.
From my perspective, in terms of breast imaging, the change is definitely from advocacy, from education to execution. Very difficult, and I'm sure anybody will relate to this. At the end of the day, we have to get this technology in the hands of women, in the hands of patients. Adoption is difficult. It's a healthcare system, so everything is based on data, on clinical studies. You have to, that's the most important point. At the end of the day, those studies have to be compared to the others, to the standard of care in the breast imaging today. Obviously, it's in the context of mammography and handheld ultrasound and MRI. So QT imaging brings a different dimension, the biomarkers, the physiological biomarkers to look into the structure of the breast tissue. Imaging till recently was extremely focused on findings, looking at the anatomy, but we are definitely moving towards measuring the biology. So we're looking into quantitative biomarkers, so moving from from subjective to objective. We're measuring. That's the shift is in my opinion, from the point of view of imaging for breast, is to move from subjective to objective to measure, to get to the values that will help radiologists, that will help doctors, that will help patients at the end of the day. Back to execution, adoption is a major hurdle for technology as QT imaging, and that's even though it is 3D ultrasound is safe, is of the resolution of MRI, healthcare system has to accept it. Women have to get the benefit of it as this technology gets embedded into the standard of care. I will fight with courage, with support. We'll work with regulators, we'll work with the healthcare system to get this technology accepted as the other thing as standard of care. We need options. Women with dense breast need options next to the other imaging modalities in the system. So, execution.
Amazing. Thank you. Caroline? Yeah, and I just want to talk about, the fact that we're all here and we're all talking about women's health. That's been an amazing shift in the last probably 5 years. And I think one thing that drove this was probably COVID, because it was the one time we realized that, and it was this large, natural experiment where we realized that men and women were responding to a disease differently. And that brought up the question, how is our immune system different? Why are women more protected against COVID than men are? And that comes down to the fact that women have a stronger antiviral immune response, which is great when you think about COVID, not so great when you think about autoimmune disease, because that's what's driving the disease. So that's our big shift, is actually understanding that men and women are different, and that we need to understand those differences. I think the challenge is going to be bringing that home. And I think you've all, referred to that. We need sustained interests, sustained funding. We need things that affect women to be mandated, and mandating basically policy changes, including more women in clinical trials, starting to think about all the research that we're generating, the data that we're generating, and actually mandating that people analyze data in a sex-specific way, which is not happening. It absolutely stuns me when I'm hearing talks from people, some very, very, prestigious researchers, and you ask the question, what are there differences between male and females in this study? We didn't look at it. And I think one thing that's going to really drive things in the future is we have all these new tools now. We're generating oodles of data, so my technical term. And that data is, for the most part now publicly available, whether it's data from wearable technology, genomics, proteomics, imaging, it's publicly available. And we can now start to ask those questions about male and female differences across diseases in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think there's great hope, there's a great future. I think AI is going to drive a huge amount of this as well, and a huge amount of the change. But I also think keeping these conversations going and making sure that we're thinking in a way that actually, sustains funding in women's health research, which has been woefully underfunded compared to men's research, but also sustaining the funding so that these, any new innovations that we generate actually make it through to the clinic. Because a lot of times brilliant ideas start, but they're not actually pursued and brought to the clinic. So,
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. And just on that point, and we'll come back to you. You've got this data that's kind of like staring you in the face. Why, one for you, Susan, why has it been historically underfunded relative to its impact, would you say?
So at least in the US, right, women actually didn't participate in clinical trials for a long time until the 90s. And initially started as more of a safety concern for women in pregnancy, etc. And it was only for the initial stages of clinical trials when they were testing for safety concerns of the drug. However, because it sort of became status quo, women just ended up being under-enrolled even in later stage clinical trials. So in the 90s, now we're sort of playing catch up. And it's not a rule that a clinical trial has to enroll equal proportions of men or women, but it is encouraged to. And now we're actually understanding biologically, as mentioned, that there are actual differences on the immunology side. There are differences genetically, etc., as to like the need to actually have to analyze women and men differently in these data. Some trials do it as sub-cohort analysis, etc., after a clinical trial is already completed, but it is still on the rare side, and we're still definitely bridging that gap.
Yeah. Carol, one point to add, this is it came to my mind. Safe imaging modalities are so critical to bring in women to the clinical studies. For example, therapies for breast cancer. If we could have the woman getting on a screening procedure every 2 weeks rather than every 3 months when the MRI machine is available, we would know if the therapy works or not, and the doctor would be able to change it faster rather than waiting for the woman to go to 3 months of therapy of a certain kind. So that's why we focused on 3D ultrasound. Ultrasound is safe. Ultrasound is extremely accurate, and definitely this imaging modality can be used for screening or often to determine if the therapy are right or not.
Amazing, thank you. And Jai, I was wondering if you had anything to add, maybe from a more research point of view, about why women's health has historically been under prioritized, apart from the obvious.
Well, you think I had a different specialty of obviously that is not only female related. One big problem when I see clinically is that there are very few female cardiologists. I think in the US it's probably 15-16% of all cardiologists that are actually women. The same probably in the UK, a little bit more on the European continent. But we know from big research studies that when women treat women, they fare better. And that's particularly true when it comes to cardiovascular disease, like heart failure, for instance. This diagnosis is quite complicated and most often, very often overlooked. And with the new patterns of disease that has come along with particularly obesity in the Western world, a lot of women do not tolerate a huge overweight very well. So they develop heart failure with what's called preserved ejection fraction. That is a very difficult diagnosis. And if women present, for instance, at the ER with symptoms that are sort of sounding like it could be menopause, they're often rejected in the ER and sent home. And then they can come back repetitively. And what I've done in my clinic is to try to do an early detection. And I'd also tried to train doctors to take these patients in and at least look at them, because otherwise they go back home, they feel a little bit shameful that they have come and they've done unnecessary, problems for the ER or whatever. But I think we need to understand that women usually have gone through a lot in life, childbirth and things like that. If they're very concerned, you need to listen to them. So that is a shift. I also think that maybe women are not so prone to sitting in the back anymore. I think we're actually trying to enable each other to speak up and change things. And I'll give you an example. I recently done a huge clinical trial for my previous company, and there we were trying to include a lot of women who had heart failure, and it was very, very difficult to do. And when I look back on it, even when we had it on the forefront, you should include a lot of women. This is particularly in preserved ejection fraction. You should include these women. They are more prone to get this disease than men. We still ended up having lots of more men than women, which is kind of weird because this is a disease that predominates in the female spectrum. The reason being that the PIs, the primary investigators, are men, cardiologists, men, who include these patients in the trials. And unless that changes and we get more female investigators interested in research, which is a very troublesome way of life. It's not because it's easy, but I mean, you cannot get women to engage in science and in those fields that are a little bit more difficult for women. I don't think it's going to change anytime very soon.
Yeah.
But there's definitely hope.
Absolutely. And how would you suggest we can get more women interested?
Like events like this where you mix biotechs. I think there's an alarming lack of cardiovascular biotechs run by women. That should change. I think women need to. I was actually very inspired by Martina saying that she never thought of competition as being a bad thing, because when she was competing against another world player, they were making each other better as they went along. And I think that's a good way of looking at things. We don't need to compete against each other. We can compete with each other and make everybody become better.
Yeah,
That's one thing that needs to change.
that's such a nice perspective to take away. Do you think to add, Karen?
Yeah, and just, on clinical trials, one of the things that one of the things I think that stops women taking part in clinical trials is the fact that they have so many other responsibilities at home. And I think if we make clinical trials easier with more remote monitoring, sampling, telehealth, I think that's going to, shift the needle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're carrying a lot of the time when they're carrying emotional load of families, they are running a household, they're also working, and sometimes their own health does get put on the back burner a bit, and that's something that does need to change.
Did you think, Kara, on competitions, as Jai mentioned, in commercial world, competition is essential. We encourage competition. Otherwise, we don't make progress. So such an interesting point. We have to have options, and we have to have competition so we become better from what we are today to what we need to achieve, what we actually deliver to some patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that point, maybe this is one for you, Susan. What does a women's health company or a new product, a new innovation have to show to actually attract long-term capital that will actually turn ideas into reality?
Interesting. So, honestly, at least for me as an investor, I always come from the perspective of looking at the asset first, right? Every good asset that you need to bring to women needs to have a solid foundation from a scientific perspective, a clinical perspective, etc. But then it really does actually kind of come down to the whole package of who's the management team behind it. Is there does the company have the right mission? Do they have the right drive, the right passion, the communication skills in terms of if it's later stage asset, are they talking to the right regulators to get it through payers, insurance, commercialization? It's multiple steps along the way for you to get capital, and capital just doesn't come in just one chunk. Capital comes at multiple milestones throughout the whole journey of a drug being in development to the market. And as an investor, I think my role is to supply capital, but my role is also to help them get through each milestone so that they could continue to get capital, because, right, I invest mostly in public companies. So those public companies, you guys can invest those companies too when you see a drug that's getting very popular, a lot of attention, etc. But when it comes to actually getting sustained capital, there needs to be a bridging of the fragmentation we see right now of their infrastructure, our system.
Amazing. Yeah. Is there anything to add from kind of coming out from the other side that you've learned about that journey?
My opinion, a company that's going to make it in the next decade has to have real clinical data, real technology, real impact in terms of imaging in my case, but each one of them is different, to get direct impact to the patients.
Right.
Yeah, I will say this, coming from a pharmaceutical company, that one of the things that people don't think about from the toolbox of they invented something to how do we actually get this product on the market is regulatory. And those steps right now are so enormously difficult. One of the reasons being that, for instance, in the US, they've cut so much back on the Federal Drug Administration on staff that all of us are in a queue to get our products through regulatory. So just something you would think that's a little step is actually becoming very, very difficult. And when it comes to competition, I think a lot of us, we are competing against each other with the same kinds of drugs, right? So the anti-lipid lowering therapies, we're competing 10 different companies against each other. That, of course, makes it better, but it also draws a lot of resources because all these trials, there are 10,000, 20,000 patients per trial. You can imagine that costs several billions of dollars to run a trial like that. So if we all do the same thing, it's actually very difficult to look at biotech coming in with new things because it's so easy to always say no, 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 I don't like it. No, I don't believe it. When you actually haven't had the foundation research wise to come into in a large trial to actually say does it work or does it not work, right? And then you come into the regulatory endpoints of how do you make a new heart failure drug? It's very, very difficult because there's no surrogate endpoints.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things are very difficult. But I just want to mention one little thing that we all could do, and that is to go home and tell young women to stop smoking. Because that would actually prevent a lot of people from having cardiac disease later on. Because when women smoke, they do much worse than men. And that's just it's a very, very overseen little fact.
Can I tell you a story from a research perspective about getting a medical device or diagnostic to the clinic? And this was actually from colleagues of mine at Cedars. It was a team of a researcher and a clinician who was a nephrologist, and then Sarah Kilpatrick, who's the head of OBGYN at Cedars. And the team was interested in preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is obviously, devastating for women when they're in their pregnancy. But we have no test. And so they had discovered a protein that was elevated during preeclampsia in women who suffered from it. And so they wanted to develop a test for this. They couldn't get any drug company involved. So what they did was they went to Cedars, and Cedars, funds basic science like this in order to bring things to the clinic or to investors. And they got seed funding from Cedars. Then they went to the FDA. And once they had their data and their proof of concept, they went to the FDA themselves, these 3 individuals, and they brought the drug companies with them. And they basically did everything in a totally different way to anybody else I've ever heard has basically got a diagnostic tool to the market. And so now this, based on the approach that they took, the initial investment from Cedars, and then the dedication of these 3 individuals, we now have a diagnostic for preeclampsia on the market, which is basically measurement of this soluble FIT1. Now they're trying to take it to the next stage where they actually have a lateral flow test. So instead of actually having to measure it clinically, now we have a lateral flow test, which is similar to the flow test that we do for COVID. So, this real innovation can happen in very different ways, and it doesn't have to always happen through, the channels that we all think about. And I think the more people that are willing to disrupt the way that we approach these things and really have vision and drive to take things through, I think, we are definitely going to shift the needle. But I thought I really wanted to share that. These are amazing individuals at Cedars that have brought something very, very important to women during pregnancy.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And then Raluca, sorry. I just want to hear from you, what is the next step to make this amazing technology available to women anywhere and for it to be applicable as mammograms?
Great question. So I do imagine the future of breast imaging being biomarker driven, measurement driven, as I mentioned earlier. But to your point, accessibility is extremely important. It's point is to have this technology, great technology in the lab, in the clinical studies, if we don't make it accessible to women. So we do have various imaging technologies today in the market. The bone standard is MRI. Mammography is extremely important. If there's one thing that I would recommend, as Jaya mentioned yesterday, go get screening. Each one of us has to go get a screening at the right age, and earlier the better. But going back, accessibility. So generating these technologies and making sure they get adopted, they get to the women, and they are affordable, and the technology is scalable. These are challenges we always have to put up with, and we have to solve day in and day out. MRI is expensive. We are trying to compare ourselves to MRI in terms of resolution, but we do bring to the market the technology that's much cheaper, that's accessible to women. So that's our goal. So if you ask me, the next decade, it's all going to be about biomarkers, measurements, getting the clinical data to measure this.
Amazing. Thank you.
Can I add something?
Of course.
Because before today, I've actually never heard of QT, but that's also because I invest in drugs specifically, not tools and diagnostics. But at Tiro, we also have a tools and diagnostics team. And just by hearing you talking about, right, like there's this payer discrepancy where it's very, very hard for this technology to reach the patients. This is actually one of the factors when it comes to investing that we would consider in terms of what is the commercial scale that is going to be behind this investment. But in terms of what this can do for women, sometimes if you do see this opportunity where that disconnect, it's actually really, really important for investors to get it early before you get the payer coverage, and then make that investment early on and get your returns once they can reach patients. So I reached out for her contact information.
Oh, there we go. Networking. Helen, that's great to hear. Before we get into questions, just because I'm conscious of time, if we can take one bit of advice from each of you amazing women, if we can go around and if you got one piece of advice or one way to stay optimistic, that would be great. Do you want to start?
Okay, I'll start. I think I am somebody who has been a combination being fairly lucky on top of being successful, but that's because I think I have very high conviction behind what I do. And then when you have conviction in anything you do and being able to speak your mind and let other people know your conviction, right? Like that really shines, and it inspires other people around you to speak their mind and also have more conviction if they relate to what you're thinking. So honestly, how we make change anywhere is by just having open communication and just having that faith that, people around you are going to react more positively than negatively.
So true. Don't get discouraged. And there's work to be done, but there's a lot of progress. The regulators, the investors, as you hear, the support for change in the healthcare system is here, and it will stay. We'll keep making progress. We'll keep pushing against this wall up until women will get what they deserve from the healthcare system.
Yeah, from my angle, I think just by talking to lots of different fields, whether it's commercial or it's scientists and movements where women are more in the center, I think that will change things gradually. And I also see a very big desire in the medical community, at least for now, that women are trying to push the guidelines to change. And that is key to get people to endorse treatments, is that they are in guidelines. Otherwise, it actually doesn't really impact the general public. So I'm very positive that will come now. I think especially the European Cardiac Society, from my angle, they are trying to push this agenda. So that's very encouraging.
I think what is keeping me very optimistic about things is the younger generation of men and women coming through who are able to talk about things in a different way than our generation was able to talk about things. The Me Too movement was a cultural movement that started us all talking about rights, women's rights. And now we've taken that to healthcare, and women are being heard, they're speaking up and they're being heard. And I think that is what really has me optimistic. I think we owe it to women everywhere, and especially younger women, that we make these changes and we sustain what we've started here so that they have access to healthcare that they deserve throughout their lifetime. We have seen so many challenges to date. I'm hoping that those challenges are going to be less and less.
Amazing. Thank you. That's such a nice note to end on before we get into questions. Just to talk and to speak with conviction as well. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists today? If you want to just raise your hand. Should I give the mic? Or do you want to just... Yes. Thank you.
Of course. Do you want to say your name before you? Thank you. I'll just say, yeah, I'll stop.
Hi, my name is Maya Penn. I wanted to say that I really appreciate this conversation so much because there's so much progress still yet to be made. I'm not in the health space, but I am in sustainability and climate action here at GSET and public health. And my grandmother is also a breast cancer survivor, so I'm really excited you're talking about this new technology. This is like something I've been following for a while, so it's really exciting to hear about it. My question would be around if any of you could speak maybe a bit about, all women experience this health disparities due to societal inequities and misogyny and medical misogyny and lack of research. And then I was curious you could speak to the kind of like in that the racial disparity as well, because most of the women in my family had dealt with, for example, uterine fibroids. Actually, my mom was at Cedars-Sinai. She had a uterine fibroids, and that's something that uniquely affects a majority of Black women at a certain age. Black maternal mortality rates. There's all sorts of different things we pointed to, but just in general, how both race and gender and can affect on health outcomes and then research is something I'd be curious to hear. Then I'll speak down.
Thank you.
Do we want to take a few questions and then have the hands?
Just
Pass the mic here.
it might be easier to just answer straight away, just in case we forget though, and we'll come to next. Did anyone to have anything to jump in for that?
Yeah, so you raise an excellent point, which is not just the sex inequalities, but also the racial inequalities in healthcare throughout. And it's not just in the US, it's everywhere. There's so many diseases that disproportionately affect Black women. Lupus been one, maternal health in another. How do we address that? It's a very, very, very difficult question. I think we have to include more women of color in clinical trials, and that's been a real push within certain groupings in the US. I know from the lupus community, they have been trying to encourage, and they had lots of different forums to encourage women of color to take part in clinical trials. Because you'll always get a ton of white women who are going to take part in clinical trials, but actually getting women of color to take part is very difficult. Again, it comes down to actually giving them the support that they need to enter into these clinical trials. Access to a physician who is going to understand their own challenges that they face in entering those clinical trials. So I think that would be my first place to start.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anything to add?
Just one other thought. Maya, the Gen Z will not accept the same limitations that we had with the previous generations. It's a different fight. There are different arguments, and you're right. We have to be determined about bringing in women of color into the clinical studies. Know that, but the way that Gen Z approaches it is completely gives me hope. The youngest of the family is Gen Z. I can see how she thinks, how she brings in different dimensions than what we could have brought in. So my hope is with you guys to change the generational issues but it's our responsibility to bring in different races to the fight and to the clinical studies. You get what we need for me.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have two. Oh, anyhow, sorts. I actually didn't know, Susan, that women historically were hesitant to enroll in clinical trials. Do you guys think that's changing now in the past like 5 to 10 years? And another question I had is, how much of this is like reframing? Obviously, there's research happening in like lupus and Sjogren's, for example, and like autoimmune, obviously breast cancer as well. They're just not classified under like women's health. But I wonder if reframing a lot of the advances that are already happening kind of helps advance areas that are less well understood, like endometriosis and fibroids and all that. How do we drug them? How do we diagnose them? From all those perspectives. So just curious to get your guys' thoughts on all the above.
That's a great point. Reframing is key. I think that the other thing we have to do is like, not only do we have to reframe the questions, but we actually have to change the teams that we're bringing to these fights. So they have to be interdisciplinary. And so from a research perspective, if you're looking at endometriosis or fibroids, you need somebody who knows about, women's health, gynecology, potentially immunology. As far as I'm concerned, immunology is everything. But there's, you bring those interdisciplinary teams together, then that's when the magic happens. And yes, women's health is not just gynecological or hormonal health. It is everything that affects women. So I think we have to change that rhetoric.
Is that interdisciplinary convo happening at within an institution level already, or is that still pending? Because I know in companies, I don't know, maybe Jared can comment, in big pharma, is that happening yet? But I'm curious.
We're certainly doing it. I mean, this cruise, the center that I run, I mean, we have pilot funding that we offer to mostly junior investigators. And it's mandated that those teams have to be interdisciplinary. And actually, the way you can get funded now from the NIH, interdisciplinary teams, it is much easier to get funded that way than if you're just one person who's an immunologist working on one cell type. Now, if you bring various different modalities, imaging, omics, whatever, into a particular to ask a particular question, that is going to be much more powerful, and I think that's increasingly been recognized.
From a big pharma perspective, sadly, no. There's no allotted funding for women unless you are in reproduction, for instance. I mean, things are clearly marked for women, but large clinical trials where you are supposed to study a drug irrespective of you being a man or woman, there's no allocated market towards women. It's not there at all yet. I think maybe it will come if we can look at these subpopulations, as you call it, more clearly on the data points. But right now, because the trials are so large and they are 90% male or 80% male, those data are just not strong enough to stand on their own. So unless there are women pushing for having clinical trials where you really include 50-50 at least, then I don't think it's going to be that easy. And one of the major obstacles with doing that is that it prolongs the timelines, because when it's more difficult to include women, then you end up also having to prolong your trial length. And that costs a lot of money, and none of the really big pharma companies are invested in trying to do that. So that is a major shift of ideology, I think, that was happening there.
Can I also add? So in terms of one of the points of integration, something I notice is, right, like we have a bigger push in research centers at academia centers where these PIs, private investigators, are really looking at the discrepancies between men and women. But there are a lot of diseases where a majority of the patients get treated at community centers, the community doctors. Those doctors will follow whichever guideline that is published. They are not going to think about the gender disparities unless it's actually stated in the guideline that you should have a different treatment paradigm for each gender. So in a way, yeah, we need to reframe, like shift our mindset and actually educate more beyond what's happening in academia. And without integration through multiple systems, we're always going to have that lag.
Yeah, great point. I think we probably have time for one more. There's two more. Let's go over here, and then if we got time, we'll come.
Oh, look at hands. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you guys all for such a lovely panel today. If you were to go back, knowing what you do now, whether that pertains to your own personal life as a woman or with your career and research and everything that you've learned at this point, what would you go back and tell yourself in your early 20s?
I love that question. Should we go from who's start with you, Susan?
Can you come to me last?
It's a hard one.
I personally don't think I could have changed so much because I come from a space where I'm a minority as a woman in the specialty I chose, and I've had to fight a lot of obstacles to do what I do today, which is primarily innovation. But I don't see anything that I would have done again that way, because when you face obstacles and you overcome them, it's actually also very rewarding in a sense. So it's not like it's like a tennis match. If you win one and you win the other, and you actually feel that there's progress, even if there's setbacks once in a while. I don't think I would have chosen a different path. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I wouldn't have chosen a different path. I mean, I came into science. I just loved it. I just fell in love with it from day one. And I actually wanted to be a veterinarian, and I ended up going into science, biochemistry, so that I could get my degree to go on and do veterinary science. And as soon as I hit biochemistry, immunology, I just fell in love. So what I have always said to people is, if you follow your heart, follow your passion, then you're going to succeed. So I've had a lot of mentees in over my career, and a lot of people have gone into medicine and science because, well, for medicine, they'll make money. That's not going to be a very meaningful career. If you're passionate about something, you'll always do well, and you'll always make your way. So that's what I would tell the 20-something person that I possibly might have been, but I don't think I was ever that person.
Great.
I have a PhD in physics, so I'm drawn towards technology and towards science, just because of my background. Or I have called myself something different when I was 20, just to have patience, because through the challenges, through it, pushing and getting to where you are today, purpose is there. So universe prepares you for one day when you know you're in the right place and you've accumulated enough to be able to give. So one thing, just patience. Never stop from pushing and getting things beyond the boundaries, but give yourself the time to accumulate to be able to give.
I support Taiki. All right, came up with something. I think I feel like a lot of women share this similar experience where I think as women, we tolerate more emotionally for some reason. I don't know if it's like how we're wired or like the sense of responsibility we have to people around us. But even though, right, like I'm still fairly early in my career, I would say that I wish there were some choices I made sooner I felt like I had extra responsibility to people who probably didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
And I wish I spoke up sooner. Like now I know and I definitely speak my mind, but it definitely took a few trial and errors to get there. So yeah, like just when something doesn't serve you, end it, cut it,
I'm
and
just
move on.
learning that. Yeah. I think, yeah, and I think that's what I would add. It's not the question of my 20s that I would be taught. It's not the question I'd be asking of my 20-year-old self. It's probably my 40-year-old self, you know? And we women have different challenges than men as they go through their careers. We think about a career as being linear. It certainly isn't. It's a very windy, twisty road. And we also have challenges of healthcare, of childcare, if we're that lucky, if that's what we choose. And then we have challenges of menopause. Nobody told me menopause was going to be what it was. I felt like I was pushing a huge big boulder up a hill all the time. And at the same time, you're trying to run a busy research lab, deal with your male colleagues. You had absolutely no understanding of what is going on at all. So I think I would like to say to myself, okay, cut yourself some slack, take breaks when you can take the breaks. Ask for more flexibility when you need more flexibility. So just not be afraid of owning your hormonal changes. Yeah. So anyway.
Amazing, thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up there, but I'm sure if you want to grab anyone in particular afterwards, then you'd be welcome to have a chat. I just wanted to say thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, The Shift, for the invitation. And thank you to all our amazing panelists. It's been such a fascinating discussion this week. Yeah. Great. Now I think we're having some fish.